All right. Now, continuing on in Parshat Bo, chapter 10, verse 21. It says that the Lord told Moshe, stretch out your hand towards the heavens, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. Now this is literally what it says, that it may be felt. You know, there's some advertisements of about wine that it's so thick you can almost cut it with a knife, if you've ever heard that expression. In other words, the darkness was felt. It was so thick, the darkness was felt. And then in verse 23 it says, they could not see each other. It was so dark that they couldn't see each other. V'lo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim. And they couldn't get up from their chair. They couldn't get up from their chair, it says. Or I should say, they didn't rise from their chair. We can say that maybe because they were afraid they would fall and so on. I mean, but we know that sometimes the lights go out and we don't sit on the chair. We get up, we can go around if the house is familiar to us. If you lived in the house for, let's say, 5 or 6 or 10 years, is there any difficulty in getting up? No difficulty. Yet here we're told, V'lo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim. And then, in the same verse 23, it says, U'lechol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvoteihem. But insofar as Israel was concerned, they had light in their dwellings. In other words, there was darkness for the Egyptians and light for the Jews. Now it says here that God did not tell Moshe to go to Pharaoh and warn him that, listen, there's going to be another plague called darkness, and so let the Jews go. And let the Jews go. But rather immediately, without any warning, the Lord tells Moshe, bring this upon them. And here, after this, he says everyone should go out. Everyone can go out. However, Moshe said, our cattle also shall go with us. There shall not be a hoof left behind. In other words, the cattle was what he didn't want to be permitted to leave Egypt. And so he said, no. Leave and never come back. What happened here? And what is this another plague? And it's called one of the plagues. Why is it a plague? Well, one could say naturally if they couldn't get up from their chairs, then it's called a plague. So what happens if you can't get up? So you take a vacation for 3 days. You don't work for 3 days. Why is this called a plague? And you know, on Passover, we read the 10 plagues, of which one of these plagues is called Hoshech, darkness. Immediately following this comes the information that God tells Moses one more plague, and then chapter 12, as I have discussed in the power of the alphabet and Kabbalah and the star connection, we have here a very insignificant mitzvah precept in chapter 12 of Shemot, Parshat Bo. HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chadashim Rishon hu lachem b'chodshei hashana. That the month of Aries, Nisan, would now be proclaimed as the first month And this is the mitzvah, the precept of, as we will be doing this Shabbat, Mevorchim HaChodesh, to bless the moon, and Kiddush HaChodesh, meaning you go out and say certain prayers at the end of the 7 days. This was the prayer that was given to the Jews before Makot Bechorot, before the final plague, which was the death of the firstborn. And all of the commentators ask, again, of all the precepts of the 613 precepts that the Torah mentions, this becomes a very significant one, that before the 10th plague can come about, the Jews have to learn this precept called blessing of the new month. The answer to this question is quite obvious. The 10th plague was the demise, was the final devastation of whatever was called Egypt. The slaying of the firstborn. We have discussed the firstborn on other occasions, and so I don't want to dwell on that over again, but I must say that the firstborn, and the reason for the firstborn, is, for those of you not familiar, it means either the firstborn of a father, or if he should have been married, or he's married to other women, and he marries a woman who never had children, and then there is the birth of a child. That child is also called a firstborn. In other words, a father can have more than one firstborn, theoretically. Firstborn. The firstborn gets 2 portions of an inheritance. The slaying of the firstborn. That was the end. The slaying of the firstborn was the end of the Egyptians. What was so important about the firstborn? Why is that considered now the Jews can go out? Now the Jews can go out. Couldn't they have gone out before? Couldn't they have gone out after this plague or that plague? Now let's return to Choshech, the plague of darkness. The Ari, and of course based on Rabbi Shimon's interpretation, the Ari claims that darkness is an illusion. We speak so much about illusion, and yet for many of us, or most of us, when the room is lit, we can see. When the room is dark, we no longer can see. And yet, we know that people have eyes and can see very well and do not see. Now, like I said this morning, there are people who wear glasses, see very well, and there are those who do not wear glasses and do not see well. Meaning, they can't understand what's around them, whereas someone who wears glasses can see much better. It doesn't mean actual sight. Seeing or not seeing is like when you have a conversation and you have a problem. You go to somebody and say, "What do you see in this?" What do you mean, what do you see? You don't see a problem. You hear a problem. You don't see a problem. But the understanding is that seeing is beyond the physical eyesight. People make mistakes in their life or in their business. Does it mean they didn't see well? They had bad eyesight? No. He didn't see all that surrounded that particular condition. He did not see all of the circumstances. It wasn't something that was new, but he couldn't more than see with his eyes. He didn't comprehend. There was not enough intelligence. These are the factors of what constitutes darkness, night, or seeing, or light. When the Lord told Moses to create this kind of darkness, what was happening? If they had enough food, let's say the Egyptians, to last for 3 days, What's the problem? How far is it from the refrigerator to wherever you're sitting in your home? Everyone can make his way to the refrigerator. So there was no problem. It was dark. It was dark. What was so terrifying that we call this a plague? But again, it was not the darkness. It was not the darkness that was going to be the problem for the Egyptian. Remember I asked, and the other commentators ask as well, how come God didn't tell Moses to go to the Egyptians and say, we're going to bring a plague of darkness? Because the Egyptians would have said, including Pharaoh, who was a very wise man, some days you can get a very dark cloud. Very dark cloud during the day. You ever see sometimes automobiles traveling with their lights on during the day? It happens. If God had told Moshe to go to the Egyptians and say, I'm bringing a plague of darkness, they won't be able to see anything. There will be no light. The candles cannot be lit. They would have said, okay, God is bringing that kind of a cloud, and so there's darkness. It would not have impressed the Egyptian at all. Therefore, there was no purpose in God telling Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him, we're bringing a plague of darkness. That was not a plague. What is a plague? What is a plague? What is a plague? If suddenly, and this is called a plague, something unknown is striking some people and not others. Let's say the Black Plague in Europe that devastated 1/3, 30%, 33% of the European population at that time. 1/3, that's a lot of people. 1/3 of the entire population of Europe was destroyed by the Black Plague. What was so terrible about the Black Plague? People were dying. You mean there was a lot of people dying? No. That wasn't the problem. That was not the fear of a plague. The fear was that no one knew who would be struck down next, because it was an unseen force that was causing death and destruction in an abnormal way. It was not the fact that people were dying. Everyone's going to die ultimately. So why is death a plague? Is death a plague? No. This was an unseen factor. They could not attribute the cause to something that they could put their hands on. And so the fear of maybe they would be struck down by something that they had no control over. That is fear. AIDS is a plague. Why is it a plague? They don't know what really causes it, and furthermore, they don't know how you can prevent it. There's a fear. Who knows who it will strike? Who knows who it may strike? That is the fear. Not the fact that people are dying from AIDS. That is not the fear. That is not the plague of AIDS. The plague of AIDS is maybe someone has contracted AIDS, and according again to the doctors, it takes between 15 to 25 years for it to become manifest. That is a fear. The fear of the unknown. Who is going to be struck down? You can't tell who already is a carrier, even though they think today they have a method by which they can tell, but it is only in the later stages. But who was struck with it at the beginning? No one knows. That is called plague. What happened here And therefore, it was not a plague that could be related to Pharaoh, and therefore it was immediately brought about by the fact that U'lechol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. What was the fear? They couldn't get up from their chair. Why couldn't they get up? So that the darkness was thick. He couldn't move. It was thick. Darkness is thick. Is the Torah talking about measurements in density? No. No. The fear that there was a concept that some people are struck with light and some people are struck with darkness is a fear. Because now you can see that there is an unseen cause. Why is there light? How could there be light in one part of the room and darkness in the other part of the room? In other words, if there was an Egyptian sitting together with an Israelite in the same room, he experienced darkness and he understood, or even his consciousness told him, that the Israeli is not undergoing that fear of darkness. He has light. That was the significant aspect of the plague. This now became a trauma for him. That this was not something that everyone was undergoing. No. There was something here that was selecting here, yes, and here, no. The uncertainty of who was going to be selected. And he was the one who was selected, and other people not. It is the same selection that went on in concentration camps, where everyone would line up, and they knew one side you live, one side you die. And the people, as they approached this person who was going to make the selection, there was a fear. Would I be selected? And where to what would I be selected? To life or to death? The fear of not knowing. That was a plague, and that's why it's called a plague. Now, what does it mean they couldn't get up? Lo kam ish mitachtav. Does it mean they couldn't? And shloshet yamim. They lost all capacity of consciousness. It doesn't mean they starved. It doesn't mean they couldn't eat. It doesn't mean that they could not function. They lost all form of consciousness. When we say we see, remember I said, we go sometimes to someone who we feel can advise us. And we say, what do you see in this? Are you asking him to take a look with his eyes at your question? No. You're asking him to reveal for you a certain consciousness that you feel this person has that you do not have. He has some form of consciousness, some form of understanding that you do not have. And therefore you go and you say, what do you see? Meaning consciousness. Here the Egyptian, and this was the plague, lost all form of consciousness. It was total darkness. What is total darkness? Someone has a problem, a family problem, a business problem, or whatever. And he puts up his hands. He says, I don't know what to do. Why don't you know what to do? I can't think of anything. What does it mean? I can't see anything. What does it mean? He has no brain? Does it mean he has no eyes? He has no ears? No, he has lost total consciousness. That's what the plague was about. Suddenly, they could not think, they could not see, nothing existed for them. Now, can you picture something as if there is no light? There is no light to show them something, a way, a path. That was the plague that overcame these Egyptians, and that was a fear. But that was not something that you could warn the Egyptians about. A plague of locusts, a plague of frogs, and things of that nature. Something which dealt with the physical aspect. Darkness, and people have fears of darkness. There are people who must have a light on in the room. People can't go to sleep without a light on. Why? Where does that fear come from? Is there someone in the room that they suspect, that they don't see? And so now that they have the light on, is there any logic to why someone would not want to go to sleep unless the light was on? No logic. And it is truly an unfounded fear. And so some people will have to go to a psychiatrist, psychologist, and he will make an attempt to remove what he calls an unfounded fear. But the truth of the matter is, there is no such thing as unfounded fears. The reason why someone will keep a light on in the bedroom and not go to and cannot fall asleep is because darkness for that individual is not what darkness means for everyone else. Most people want there to be dark in the room. They can't even go to sleep if the light is on. They don't even want that little light on. This person can't fall asleep only if the light is on. Where is the logic? The answer is there is a founded fear in this person that needs the light. Why does he need the light? Because in a certain area of his consciousness, there is a blank area within him. And he has convinced himself that with this little light, the fear or this blank, this darkness will disappear. Does it ever disappear? No. It doesn't disappear with the light on. The next night he leaves the light on again. And the psychiatrist can only try to convince this person that it's an illusion. There is a founded fear. What happened in Egypt was that the Egyptian was brought to a point where he was blank. He saw nothing, felt nothing. When it says that Vayamash HaChoshech, it comes from the word to sense, to touch, to feel. They realized there was no light. There was no illumination. All of the knowledge that they had yesterday, they forgot. All of the thinking process that usually they made use of ceased to exist. There was a total blackout of their consciousness. That was the fear. Therefore, they saw that for the Jew, how did they know that there was light? If they were sitting in total darkness, how were they conscious that there was light for the Jew? If they saw light, then there would be light for them. Do everyone follow? I mean, there can't be light here, and I can see that there's light over there, and let's say I'm sitting in the darker part of the room, and I can see that there's light, then I'm subject, and I'm participating in that light. It is not something divorced. Did they see that? It doesn't say they saw that. They realized that there was consciousness. Why? Because they could hear and see the way the Jew was behaving, that there was nothing blank. He was not what we might even say is a vegetable. He was totally conscious. The mind was functioning. In Choshech, there was a total blackout. That was the fear. Yesterday, it's almost similar to someone getting close to senility. There are people who have a fear of senility. That we're told when you get to a certain age, there's a degenerative sickness called arteriosclerosis. Memory begins to fail. Many other aspects of the individual that once he had the powers of control suddenly begin to leave. No control. That's what the plague was about. But the Jew had that control. When it says, "Ulechol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam," it's talking about light. You can walk around without light. It's talking that there was no loss of any consciousness. A total blackout. That is what that plague is about. Getting to the Kiddush HaChodesh that we were addressing, one of the methods in the Ari Sharu HaKodesh and many other Sfarim including Avram Avinu, Abraham the Patriarch's book called the Sefer Yetzirah, we learn that the letters created the universe. Letters, Aleph Bet, created the universe. In brief, when it says that the Jews were given, in chapter 12, the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctify the new moon. And those of you familiar, the only ones who really adhere to that kind of precept, the only ones, is 2% of those Jews who call themselves Orthodox. 98% don't even have any relationship to something called Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctify the new moon. What do you mean sanctify the new moon? This is what it's called, Kiddush HaChodesh. What do you mean sanctify the new moon? You make it holy? You mean you throw a little water on the moon? I mean, what does it mean you sanctify? Or as if the moon needs my sanctification. So I sanctify the new moon. It's a corruption. How do I sanctify by a prayer? Now I make the moon holy. Obviously, it has no relation to that, and therefore Jews don't practice it because there is a corruption in what Kiddush HaChodesh means. The Jews, before they could leave Egypt, before they could enjoy what was called the Exodus, they would have to have control over their destiny. We said, like the month of Cancer. Why is it called Cancer? And I'm not going to go into the details of it right now, but that is the month that if you're vulnerable, chas v'shalom, in that month, the month of Tammuz, the month of Cancer, the month of Satan, if you are vulnerable, that is when Cancer begins. That is when it begins. And so that month we have to protect ourselves. Or protect yourself from what? From what? When no one even knows what the cause of cancer is. I mean, protect yourself, you can only prevent the cause from occurring or taking hold of you. But no one even knows what it is. But we know what it is. You see, if you know Hebrew, then you know that the Satan is a crab. Satan is crab. What's crab have to do with cancer? What does crab have to do with cancer? But if you ever observe the crab, I'm surprised people still eat crabs. Because, it might cause cancer. Anyway, I guess most people don't believe in astrology, so they feel it's superstition, so they continue to eat crabs. Okay. But what is a crab? You know how a crab walks? A person can have 2 feet in motion at the same time. He moves this foot forward, and then he moves this foot forward. A crab walks side by side. He walks sideways. Did you ever try walking sideways? You've got to come to a stop. You cannot walk sideways in continual motion. When you walk forward, you keep walking. You don't stop. But try moving 1 foot, right? You move 1 foot forward. What do you do with the next foot? It meets up with the second foot. You stop. And then this foot starts the motion again. You cannot be in perpetual motion walking sideways. Everyone follows what I'm saying. There cannot be perpetual motion walking sideways. That's the only distinguishing mark of a crab. That's all. But that's everything. That's everything. The cause for cancer, and that's why Avraham Avinu gave it that name, because where did the month of Cancer come from? Did it come from Chinese astrology? Indian astrology? Islamic astrology? Where did it come from? Where is the first recordings of astrology? Tradition. But you know, in Judaism, we don't believe in tradition. We have to have a book. I don't want that someone tells me my grandfather did it that way, and so I know it must be that way. My grandfather may not have understood it. He may have thought that's the way it should be done. That didn't make it correct or incorrect. The written word, you see, is what's correct or incorrect. But tradition, by and within itself, does not validate a particular function or particular motive of behavior. Avram Avinu wrote the Sefer Yetzirah some 3,800 years ago. It is the oldest recorded document, a tribute to Avraham, recorded document on astrology, not tradition. Now they say there is Indian astrology, Chinese astrology. It dates back 5,000 years ago. There is no written document of 5,000 years ago. It may come, the tradition may have been handed down over a period of 5,000 years, and I will not say no, but I will also not say yes, because I do not have a written document to substantiate the fact that it was a written teaching. Avram Avinu says that this month of Tammuz is Cancer. What does he mean it's Cancer? It means in that month, when there is no perpetual motion, there is no circuitry. What does perpetual motion mean? Like an automobile. You ever experience an automobile? It goes, stops. And you all enjoy that kind of a ride, am I right? Goes and stops. No one likes that. You like a perpetual, smooth motion. The right and the left are functioning both at the same time. When you walk sideways, there's no perpetual motion. There is only one at a time. It's not right and left foot both operating as one unified whole. One operates at a time. There is no single complete unit. Therefore, in the month of Tammuz, you have an influence, an unseen influence that invades us with its negative energy. And if you are vulnerable at that time, and you're open, the same way as we have discussed on many occasions, Ayin Hara, that forget the Zohar for a minute, but the Talmud says that 99% of all deaths that occur in the world is Ayin Hara. Superstition, something that maybe only belongs to the Sephardim because they believe in Ayin Hara, but nobody else. But the Talmud is not part of Ashkenazi or Sephardi. Everyone studies the Talmud. And it says in the Talmud, Ayin Hara. Now what is Ayin Hara? An unseen influence that can invade. If you are vulnerable, if you are open, and you do not have a protection or a security shield around, it invades you. The same way as cancer invades some and not others. For no apparent reason. But that is absolutely incorrect. Nothing happens with no reason. There is a cause for everything that happens. The answer is because if we are vulnerable, we did not create a shield, we are then vulnerable to all of the effects of the cosmos. Tammuz is an effect of Cancer. We must protect ourselves. How do you protect yourself? The Jews were taught that before they could have actual freedom, remember this precept, chapter 12 in Exodus, chapter 12, in this week's portion of Bo, they were taught HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, all of the secrets of the cosmos. Why were they taught that? The teachings. Why did they have to know what the influences of each month was about? Because if they did not have control over unseen influences, like Satan, and many other unseen influences that exist in the cosmos, that Rabbi Shimon says that if we could see all that roams around us, we would all die of fright. The unseen influences are so demonic, says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that if they suddenly lifted the veils over our eyes and we saw what was hovering around us, we would die of fright. The pahad, the fear would be so great. And therefore, to create a feeling of possibly self-protection, we don't see it all. But that doesn't mean they're not there.
Maybe that's why some people need light. Maybe when there's dark, they can see.
But in any event, the reason why they were given this month, Chodesh Hazeh, before the Exodus, because even if they left Egypt, which they didn't want to, they did not want to leave Egypt, because the story of the Exodus has nothing to do with whether the Jews left Egypt or didn't leave Egypt. What they received here was the teachings of freedom. Whether they themselves appreciated freedom, the actual leaving of Egypt. If we look through the entire Torah, one thing weaves itself through every parasha, and that was Moshe. Why did you take us out of Egypt? You know how good the food was there? The fish was exceptionally tasty. Right through. And you bring us into a wilderness for us to die. So it couldn't have been that bad. So what is freedom that we are discussing in this week's Parsha? They left Egypt. They left Egypt. Because here was the revelation. And the Zohar says, why was it in Egypt and nowhere else? Because where there was the greatest amount of darkness, that could be the only place where there could be the greatest revelation of light. Now, like we say, if you don't want to find a cure for poison ivy, you have to look right next to the branch, because there's another tree that has the cure. Wherever the problem lies, so lies the cure. If cancer is the problem of short-circuitedness, not continuity, not circuitry, then you know what the problem is, and you know what the cure is. But how do we protect ourselves? If we are vulnerable, we were given the power to control the cosmos. If the Jews left Egypt and never got this mitzvah called Kiddush HaChodesh, even if they had left and they had gone to an island where nobody could ever touch them, they would never be free people. Because on an island, all by yourself, nothing will prevent cancer. Nothing can prevent an earthquake. Nothing can prevent lightning from striking. So where is the freedom of fear? Where? Where in this universe? To run to another country? Where can you run to achieve freedom? There's only one place you can run to achieve freedom, and that's right where you are. To create freedom where you are. Not somewhere, but where you are. If there is freedom established where you are, you have freedom. But to seek freedom always elsewhere is never achieved, because the same uncertainties, the same problems that exist here can also exist there. What guarantees? Therefore, before we could have what is considered to be the Exodus, freedom, and we are not discussing freedom of leaving of Egypt, but we are discussing freedom. Freedom meaning of every fear that people in the world have. They were given the letters that we use every Chodesh, the Tefillah of Rosh Chodesh, uses one of the particular letters of the 72 names because there are forces. And each month there are new forces that operate in each particular month. Positive forces and negative forces. How do you protect oneself? By the Aleph Bet. By the Aleph Bet. By having a connection with that letter and with another Bakoach, which we also recite, that provides that kind of protection. Freedom, first, is protection from unseen invading influences. Without that, there is no protection. Therefore, before the Jews could go out of Egypt, the physical leaving of Egypt, the physical departure from this bondage was only through the Kiddush HaChodesh. Which brings us to the next idea about which the Zohar discusses. It says that the Lord told Moshe that there is one more plague that I'm going to bring upon the Egyptians. That is the slaying of the firstborn. And what does it say in chapter 11? Vayomer Moshe ko amar Hashem. So said the Lord. Kachatzot olayla ani yotzeh betoch Mitzrayim. At 12 midnight, approximately 12 midnight, I will go throughout the land of Egypt, and he continues, I will slaughter all of the firstborn. All of the firstborn, only of the Egyptians, and after that, all of the Jews will be released from bondage. And the Zohar asks a very simple question. Why, in the Zohar, in this Parsha, it's several questions he has. First of all, he asks, why in the middle of the night? He says it's like Jews left in the middle of the night, like they were hiding something, didn't want anyone to see them. Why didn't he create the miracle of the plague, of the slaying of the firstborn during the day? Why at midnight? Why at midnight? Why shouldn't he have slaughtered, if this was necessary for the freeing of the Jew? Why didn't he slay the Egyptians when everyone can see what was happening? At night, no one knew. Everyone was in their own homes. It was dark. No one could see. Why didn't he, at that time, slay the firstborn? Why did he wait during the night? All right? And the Zohar says, and there was another word that he says, and we have to understand the Zohar. Moses said kachatzot. In Hebrew, that means approximately. Approximately at 12 o'clock midnight, God is going to slay the firstborn. God doesn't know when it's 12 o'clock. Everyone knows when 12 o'clock is. We all have watches. We can all determine when 12 o'clock is. Says the Zohar, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla, kachatzi hayat tzarich lomar, o kachatzot. Moses said, approximately. But when the Lord slayed the firstborn, it says, right smack in the middle of them at 12 o'clock. He says, why? Because if Moses said approximately 12 o'clock, and let's say it happened 1 minute before 12, says the Zohar, he says some people, and that's some of the commentators, why did Moses say kachatzot? Because if it didn't happen exactly at 12 o'clock, let's say it happened at 11 o'clock and 59 minutes, or it happened at 12 o'clock and 1 minute, then maybe Moses was a liar. You see, the slaying of the firstborn was not true. What difference does it make if you think that it happened at 12:01, you would question the fact that a plague was going on? Why 12 o'clock? Says some of the commentators, and Rabbi Shimon says, there are those who say, because then Moses would be a liar. You see, if the plague happened at 12:01, and Moses says it would happen at 12 o'clock, then he would be called a liar. So therefore, Moses said approximately. Says Rabbi Shimon, that doesn't sound plausible. I mean, you're talking about a plague of slaying of the firstborn. All of a sudden, a plague from out of nowhere. All the firstborn of the Egyptians die, and all of the firstborn of the Israelites are alive, and if it happened at 12:01, Moses would be considered a liar. Doesn't sound logical. Does anyone accept that kind of reasoning? That's the reason Moses said kachasot. Answers the Zohar in greater detail, but I'm taking out the essence of what he's trying to say. Again, we are dealing with cosmos. We are dealing with cosmos. When it says 12 o'clock, it was 12 o'clock. And if it happened 12:01 or 11:59, that was not the significance. But there is an old Kabbalistic tradition that when one wakes up after 12 o'clock, from 12 o'clock midnight on, in fact, until the rising of the morning star, that is the time best suited for work. The joke about that is, well, that's when most people are sleeping, so, nobody really is going to bother you. So maybe it's a good time for work. But that's not the essence and real reason for waking up after 12 o'clock. The Zohar says that at 12 o'clock and onwards, the power of the cosmos are in circuitry. Circuitry like a bulb. It is in constant flowing of light. Light. The slaying of the firstborn could only take place after 12 o'clock, not at 11:59. It could not take place. It could not take place during the day. The slaying of the firstborn, the miracle, it is a miracle. All the firstborn to be slain at that moment is a miracle. And whatever cause or whatever plague was present, it didn't slay any of the Jews who were firstborn. A miracle. But again, are we talking, someone had raised the question. It says thou shalt not kill. Yet, I once had a friend, a doctor, who said that if he ever wanted a real good murder story, the best place he would find for reading of murder was the Bible. Because if you read through the Bible, a good part of the Bible is devoted to killing. He killed this one, and they killed them, and they're told to kill these people, and they're told to kill these people. It's a whole story of murder when, in essence, one of the 10 Commandments is, thou shalt not kill. How do you reconcile all this murder? And even the Zohar says that when the Jews wanted to sing, it bothers the Lord when his creatures or mankind suffers. And it makes no difference whether it is Jew or non-Jew. Makes no difference. In fact, when the Jews wanted to sing, it says in the Zohar and all other commentators and in the Talmud, he said, do not sing, az yashir. Sing later, not now. Now is not a time for rejoicing, because mankind is mankind, no matter what label you have. No matter what level of consciousness you are, if you're a Jewish consciousness, and nobody knows for sure who that is, but Jewish consciousness only means a greater desire to receive, and therefore a greater ability to achieve a higher level of consciousness. All peoples are the people of God. And therefore, the Jews at the time of the splitting of the Red Sea were told not to sing, because the Egyptians were drowning. And so, what's going on over here? Slaying of the firstborn. What do you mean slaying? Again, killing and killing and killing. That, ultimately, we can always justify and rationalize why I'm permitted to kill somebody too. Where is the limit? If the Torah is constantly prescribing murder as the solution, remember the golden calf? Moses told the Leviim, the Levites, slay the Jews of the golden calf, and it's recorded. They took a spear, the Leviim, the Levites, and slew 3,000 Jews. Who is to say who is not permitted or who is permitted? Says the Zohar, we are not discussing here people. The energy intelligence, the force behind the Egyptians was a desire to receive for oneself alone. They brought that to the world, and that's the way they control the world. That was the evil that was instilled in all of mankind, including the Jew. Because it says that the Jew had achieved the 49th gate, such a high level of evilness. Were they deserving of leaving Egypt? Of course not. No. They were not deserving, and had they achieved one more level of evil consciousness, they would never have been taken out of Egypt. What was going on here, as we discussed before? Freedom. Freedom from those limitations. Freedom of plagues, freedom of illness, freedom of mishaps. When we are discussing the slaying of the firstborn had a particular power that all of the other Egyptians did not have. They had a force called the desire to receive for oneself alone. If that force was not broken, then there would be no freedom in the world. The reason for the slaying of the firstborn, because they were the most powerful channels for this kind of evil in the universe. And when we discuss the slaying, we are not even discussing the physical slaying of people. We are discussing force, power. The force that creates cancer. It's a force. You know what kind of a force it is? The force that drives people into fear. Not only those who have cancer, but those who don't. And chas v'shalom think that maybe they might become susceptible the same way as AIDS. The fear. They were not slain. These Egyptians weren't slain. What was slain was that power by which they controlled the world. Whenever the Torah is talking about removing or destroying people, as we think it refers to, it is not referring to physical people. It says you're not allowed to kill, you're not allowed to kill. Destroying the human body is not what the Torah was talking about. It was talking about the evil consciousness that existed in the firstborn, the evil consciousness that existed in the Erev Rav that we still have today. What was the Erev Rav? The Erev Rav was that Jew who always says, what did you do for me today? For that Jew who says, I forgot yesterday. The Jews had seen the miracles. All of a sudden they're asking Moses, Did you bring us out here to starve? We don't have any water. What kind of a man are you? I mean, Moses could be the channel for creation of 10 plagues, splitting of the Red Sea, bringing down manna from heaven, but all of a sudden he can't produce water for the Jews in the desert. What kind of a Jew is that? The habitual complainer. The habitual complainer and never satisfied with what he has, but always thinking of what he could have. Erev Rav. When it says that when Moshe told the Levites to slaughter the Jews, that would be a bad example and a bad lesson for future generations. One Jew is permitted to kill the other Jew. If I think he's evil, then what prevents me? You mean because Moses didn't tell me? So let's say there is another great leader that says, kill, like in some cases in Israel today. Jews beat up Jews. The rabbi says these people should be destroyed. And that's the way they behave today in Israel. Nothing new. So they don't physically, they torture him mentally and otherwise. The golden calf people were not destroyed. What was destroyed by the Levites was that evil. It wasn't destroyed forever, unfortunately. It's still with us. But those 3,000 people had their negative energy intelligence removed, slaughtered, taken away. That is what was taking place in Egypt. Nothing on the physical level as we read this whole story. For reading the story itself has absolutely no meaning. But as we went from one chapter to the next, no meaning whatsoever. Absolutely none. And I want to close with one small concept over here. Do you remember? God tells Moses that when you're ready to go out of Egypt, do you remember what he told him to do? He says, I am going to put you in the favor of the Egyptians. And as you leave, everyone should borrow gold, silver, and everything else from the Egyptians. Chapter 11, verse 2. Speak down the ears of the people and let them ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor jewels of silver and jewels of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and they took out all the gold and silver that was in Egypt. What's that about? I mean, they got to get out of the country. First of all, what are they going to do with the gold and silver in the wilderness? Who are they going to buy from? What are they going to import? What will they export? What kind of letter of credits do they need? They're in the wilderness. I mean, just to hoard gold? Corner the market, maybe? There was no market. They had all the gold and silver of the whole world. No more gold and silver left. But what struck me was what it says, and here is how you have to study the Torah. It says, and you have to know the Hebrew. See, the English is a corruption, and every other language, incidentally, is also corruption. What does it say in the English? And let them ask every man of his neighbor. How do you say ask in Hebrew? How do you say ask? Lishol. Okay. What? Usually it means levakesh. Bakasha. Right? Lishol means to borrow. God told the Jews to borrow the money. That's what it says. Can't change that. It says, Vayishalu ish mereu. They should borrow. What do you mean? Then you would have to pay it back sometime? Why did he say the word borrow? The answer is, God knew what the Jew is all about. He knew how evil he could be. And, incidentally, I've done some research on Spain, and I found out that the Jews of Spain brought all of the world's riches to Spain. All the gold and silver of the world. And if you learn a little about history, you see that all of these expeditions were out for one purpose. What was the purpose? Bring back gold and silver. Gold and silver. That was the whole objective. Bring back gold and silver. Same thing. Bring back gold and silver. What is gold and silver? And what was the purpose here? Were they borrowing money for whom? For what reason? And they were borrowing it. They weren't taking it. They were not taking it. I just want to say that the money that the Jew has is always borrowed. And what he does with it will determine if he stays with it or not. He has to treat money as a vehicle, as a channel, not as an end. It is a means. It is not an end. It is not the accumulation. See, had he told the Jews, take all the money, take all the gold and silver, he was trying to teach us that you can't take gold and silver. You can borrow and make use of it. When you borrow something, you borrow someone's cow, you borrow someone's mixer. You borrow it to make use of it. The fact that I possess it or do not possess it does not make that a workable, functionable item. Some people deposited their money in Switzerland for safekeeping. That when they survived the war, if they survived the war, they would have it. But not many people survived the war. Money is not something you possess. Money is something you make use of.